Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to do a very short session. I think it deserves its own day, really. It's probably the most widely studied insect that we have on the planet. And to do anything on honeybees in a small amount of time is not do it justice. But the objective of today is just to get people, pest controllers, a bit more familiar with some of the other bees that we have in the UK. And it was really apt this morning that as I left my car to come into the building this morning, on the side of my car was one of these solitary bees. And I imagine that now the weather here is starting to improve a little bit, temperatures are starting to come up. These are going to be something that pest controllers are going to come into contact with on a regular basis. And I think as a pest controller, it's one of those topics, the solitary bees, that we don't know a lot about, because we shouldn't, in my opinion, really be doing treatments for these, but we need to educate people and we need to speak about them so that people understand why our need not to necessarily treat, and there are some situations where you may treat, but in general, the role here is to educate the public as to why we've taken the decision that we've taken. So my name is Paul Westgate. I'm the Managing Director of Veritas Pest Consultancy, an organisation that helps people who want to do good pest control, really. We support food manufacturers, pest controllers, trade associations, distributors, both here in the UK and overseas as well. As I regularly say, I've been doing this for 25 years now. I need to update the slides a little bit. I know absolutely nothing about pest control in my 25 years. I've learned a little bit, but I'm very aware there's a huge amount still to know. And every time we look at a different aspect of pest control, we find something new. And certainly in the research of putting this together, I've certainly improved on my knowledge of solitary bees, and hopefully we can get across some key points for you today that's going to maybe help you in the upcoming months when these things start to appear. So when we're talking about ants, bees and wasps, they fall into the Hymenoptera order of insects. So insects, as I'm sure everyone knows, 6 legs, 3 body parts, and they're divided into these orders. And some of the main orders are shown on the screen here for you now. What makes something a Hymenoptera is these four wings, which is a crucial diagnostic characteristic, and they're often hooked together using these little hooks between the fore and the hind wing. So it often does appear that there is just one pair of wings, but there are actually 2. They generally have a waist appearance. This is constriction in the middle section, and just listening to some of John's slides there, you can see that really nicely in that picture of the Rogers ant they showed towards the end there, that waist area of the Hymenoptera. They go through complete metamorphosis, so there is this egg, larvae, pupal stage. And as we'll be aware with the wasps, which obviously form part of the Hymenoptera, some of them are incredibly social, and that helps us when we're thinking about how we control these things. So if we were to look at Hymenoptera, very briefly, it's divided into some suborders. You've got the wasps and social ones, and these have a very clear waist section. They generally feed on protein or pollen, and they have a stinger. They have an adapted ovipositor, an egg-laying tube that's at the back of some of these other Hymenoptera, and that's been adapted into a stinger. We have the parasitica, and this is where we find the parasitic wasps. I think there's probably around 7,000 species of these. And these are the things that parasitize other insects normally. They've often got this long piercing ovipositor at the back, which they use to stab into other insect larvae to lay their eggs. And then we have the symphyta, which are sawflies. And these are really fat in their appearance and don't have so much of a waist. And social bees and wasps fall into the ocellates. Parasitica is our parasitic wasps, and here we see one. This is some kind of ecthumoid wasp that's sort of using that ovipositor to pierce into a hole to lay its egg inside some form of caterpillar, some beetle larvae probably that's deep inside that wood. And then the symphyta, here we have the sawflies. And these tend to be pests of agriculture, of plants. The larvae will eat leaves and affect how plants develop. And they have this ability, some of them, to create these what we call galls, these sort of responses from the plants to the insects being inside them. But it's the bees that we're looking at specifically today. And we're not going to look at all of these. There are 6 sort of main families of bees, if you like, in the UK, and they can be roughly split. It's a rough division between aerial and ground nesting. There's rough splits between bees that have got long and short tongues and those kind of things, but a lot of it's done on sort of behaviour. So The Calliotidae, there are plasterer bees. So these are solitary bees that kind of use their mandibles to collect mud and will line the inside of their nesting areas. The Halictidae, these are the sweat bees. Andrenidae, these are our mining bees. Melitidae, these are melitid bees. Megachilidae is quite a wide group of animals. This contains the leaf cutters and the masonry bees. And then we've got the true bees, if you like, the Apidae, where we find our aphis, the honeybee, the bombus, which is our bumblebees as well. And that's where we find the true social species. So when we start on our identification, we need to ask the first question, what are we seeing here? Is it a wasp or is it a bee? Answers on a postcard. And many of you will be shouting at the screen saying it's neither. And you'd be absolutely right. So our first question, is it actually a bee or is it something else? And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with these creatures, which we will know as hoverflies, a rather interesting group of flies. So these aren't even Hymenoptera at all. These are from the Diptera order. They have 2 wings and there's a little halters at the back, which you can clearly see in this, the sort of marmalade hoverfly down on the bottom row here. And this is something, I remember when I was an active pest controller, I'll get called out loads for these because these are seen buzzing around bushes. They're feeding on nectar. The adults are nectar feeders. The larvae tend to be feeders on other insects. But customers will see this and they'll first of all think, with a lot of these, they'll think wasp because of the markings. And it's a very deliberate thing for these insects. They're dressing up as wasps and bees and bumblebees even to avoid predation. So that other animals look at them and think, I'm not going to eat that because that looks like something that will sting me. And many of them, in fact, have even got the same behaviours as the thing that they're trying to mimic. So the buzzing noises, the flight patterns, those kind of things. And there's some really interesting ones here. One I quite like is the Batman hoverfly. That's a great one to get people interested in insects. And that's cool because it's got the bat logo on the pronotum there in between the bit that covers over the thorax section. And some of them are very characteristic. And there's one in particular that I want to have a look at in just a second. How do we know it's a hoverfly? Just a little ID thing for you here. This is actually a drone fly that was on my window at home. And you can see the wing veins. So when we're identifying flies, we're very much interested in the wing veins, something which we should be interested in when we're looking at bees as well. But bee wing veins are very different. And in the hoverflies, in the Seraphidae, there is this false margin. So you can see where the arrow is. There's it almost looks like the edge of the wing. That's not the edge of the wing. The wing goes on further, but there's this vein that runs around, giving this appearance. There's this kind of false vein that sits in the middle of the wing, which helps us to identify that something belongs to that Seraphidae family. The one I wanted to speak about was this one here, the hornet mimic hoverfly, Vulacella zonaria. There are other Vulacellas around. This is a large hoverfly, and it's designed to mimic a hornet. It's quite obvious, and its larvae actually they live commensally in the nest of a hornet or other social wasps, and they're feeding on all the detritus that sits at the bottom of the nest. And occasionally the larvae of the hoverfly, which you can see here, will actually eat some of the larvae of the wasp. And the reason I put this in is because they're a common thing that we get pictures through for identification. So when the pupae fall out of the nest and ready to hatch into the adults, you get this kind of appearance here, which is quite a characteristic pupa. Many pupae flies are really difficult to identify, if not impossible. But this one's very characteristic. And this would lead us to say, okay, you've got these. That means you've had a wasp nest in your loft, perhaps during the summer months because of that association. Other hoverflies here, we've got the dronefly, which is trying to pretend to be a bee. And when we're looking at dronefly control, we're looking at sort of stagnant water and those kind of things. And the bumblebee mimic on this side here, which I think it does a fantastic job of mimicking a bumblebee. They are very successful at this. So be cautious that we are identifying things correctly. There is another fly that we see this time of year, which is potentially a lot of people's favourite flies. These are called the bee flies. There's several species of these, and these are, a lot of people say that when you see a bee fly, that things are getting better in the climate. They're starting to warm up because these things are also, they're flies, and they're also parasites. The larvae live within the nests of wasps and things like that. But a good sign in the early summer. And there's lots of research that's done on these because they're quite charismatic flies. People get interested in looking up when they're coming out. So there's lots of data that suggests when they're coming out, and certainly they'll be out very soon, looking out the window today. So I said I wasn't going to talk about these things, but just in a passing mention, these of course are honeybees, and honeybees are one of the social bees. And one of the things that the social bees do is they have these adapted back legs. I think this video shows that quite well. You've got this sort of flattened pollen basket at the back there. They're very good at collecting pollen. They have to be. There's lots of mouths to feed if you're a social bee. And you'll notice that bees generally are very hairy, and that's because they're designed to collect pollen. So the pollen sticks on the animals when they're taking it back to their nest, or whether that be social or solitary. Wasps, of course, are not pollen collecting animals. They are predators, so they tend to be a lot more sleeker. They tend to be a lot less hairy, and they are obviously carnivorous in some stage of their life. Why am I not talking about bees? I think there's some fantastic organisations that are much better placed to cover this topic, and they deserve a lot more attention. I would just remind pest controllers to have a very considered approach when dealing with honeybees. There are organisations, the Zookeeper Bee Removal Group, the British Beekeepers Association. In recent years, the culture has been, thankfully, moving away from let's zap them with some kind of insecticide and moving a lot more towards the extraction and relocation and a considered approach, which fits into a lot of good publicity. We need the bees for pollination. We need the solitary bees a lot more because they are much better pollinators because of how they're set up. But I would remind people that you will potentially in the next few weeks and months start getting involved in swarm removal. Speak to organisations such as the British Beekeepers Association. Let's make sure that we are having a positive impact on our customers, on the wider environment. We shouldn't be going down the lines of chemical treatment. Now, I know there will be situations where other avenues have been explored and chemical treatment needs to be considered, but please do really consider all other options before even entertaining the idea of chemical treatment. There's a lot of potential things that can go wrong with the chemical treatment of bees, and it's something that very much is in the public domain. To quote Jurassic Park, we spent so much time thinking whether we could. We didn't think enough time of whether we should, and that's certainly a phrase I would use when thinking about chemical control of bees. You can, but should you? That would be my take on it. And we spoke about wing veins, and hopefully you can see on the bottom here a wing vein of a Hymenoptera. This is actually a honeybee, and that's quite a useful way to identify some of the solitary bees and bees in general. And one of the things we're looking for is these sort of cells that appear. These sort of, you can see the highlighted really long sausage shaped sort of marginal cell. And just below that, there are 3 what we call submarginal cells, which is quite a characteristic feature to look for when looking to have a look at that. We'll come on to the next social species, which is our bumblebees. I believe that there's arguments as to how many we have, but if we said something around 24 species, we would be quite close to the actual number. These are pretty obvious to identify, these very large bees that are wearing their woolly jumpers, and they're wearing woolly jumpers because they are a northern hemisphere species that's adapted to life in cooler temperatures. They're often one of the first ones to be seen in the year when we see these great big huge aircraft-sized queens that have emerged. I've seen a few of these knocking around in the last few sort of weeks and months, and they have, quite interestingly, they share characteristics with sort of honeybees in the fact they have these pollen baskets on their back legs that they use to collect pollen. So they wet the pollen, they stick it to the adapted part of the hind tibia and carry that back to the nest. But they also share a lot of characteristics with wasps as well, because honeybees, when they go through the winter period, they'll go through the winter period as a colony, as opposed to a wasp. In a social wasp, is just the queen that survives the winter, and that is very much true with the bumblebees. So bumblebees' nests are very disorganized, and generally quite small, getting up to the 400 or 500 individuals, as opposed to the many thousands that you would find with a honeybee nest. There is some pollen as such that is created, but they're not in that regimented, ordered structure as you would find in a honeybee nest. They don't make a nest themselves. They will use an existing hole, and inside that hole, they're really going to need to have some sort of existing nesting material. So quite often they are found within sort of old mouse burrows, or there are some species that we'll look at in just a second that go into sort of roof spaces and use the insulation or bird boxes. They don't last for very long. The workers have got a couple of week lifespan, and nests generally 2 to 6 months. These appear very early, and quite often they're gone before the end of the summer actually appears. They are short-lived. You have to work pretty hard to get them to sting you. I've been stung by bumblebees in the past, but that's generally when I've been trying to interfere with them rather than them just appearing in the house. And in fact, my kids now, if there's a bumblebee in the house, they will just put their hand out, let it walk onto their hand and let it out into the garden. And I think you have to work hard to get a bumblebee, or in fact, a lot of the solitaries, to sting you. They don't reuse the nest. Again, very wasp-like in their behaviour. They'll create a new nest each time. And just like the wasps, it's just those queens that overwinter. So the queens will go into overwintering and start that cycle again. Although it's a social bee, it's got a very different way of existing than perhaps our honeybee. One just to have a quick look at of the 24, this is the tree bumblebee. It's very distinctive. It's got this sort of orangey, furry thorax section and a black with a white tip on the abdomen. It's an aerial nesting one. So as the name suggests, it likes to nest up high, and it needs those kind of old bird nests and that kind of stuff to be able to get access to. The nest size is generally relatively large for a bumblebee. But the interesting thing is this is a relatively new species to the UK. It's been here for about 25 years. And when we look at the distribution of it, it's done really well. And why is it done really well? One of the reasons I think is because of things like bird boxes and access into lofts. So the built environment is actually very good for this type of bee. One of the other behavioural things that causes perhaps pest controllers to be interested in this bee is the male behaviour. And what they do is they hang around the outside of nests when it's breeding season. So later on in the year, later on in the summer, the males will hang around outside the nest, presumably waiting for that new queen to come out to reproduce with. And this may give that impression of a larger number of bees, bringing it to the customer's attention. With males, it's a very short period, probably a couple of weeks. And obviously the males, they don't have the ability to sting. So if your bee identification or your wasp identification is very good, then you can quite happily pick up a male bee safe in the knowledge that it won't sting you. Of course, your identification has to be very good. And it's generally antennal length is a good characteristic to use to separate males from females. Rather interestingly, there's a group of bumblebees, there's 6 of them, that are kleptoparasitic. They steal food from other animals, and what they do, these ones, is they generally appear later in the year because they need the existing bumblebee nest to be set up. They don't have queens. The workers infiltrate the nest. You can see where this is going. They kill the queen of the nest former. They lay their own eggs, and they get the workers to raise their offspring. It's quite a clever way of doing something. So these are the cuckoo bumblebees, as they're often referred to. So quite an interesting behavioural choice there. Often the topic of relocating bumblebees comes up. It is something that I've done myself back in the day. It's not something that's generally recommended. The times that I've done it, I was very much of the opinion that if I didn't take some form of action, then the customer would simply ring around the pest control community until they found that pest controller who was prepared to put the chemical into the bumblebee's nest. So I made decisions that was, actually, this probably isn't great for the bumblebees, but it's better than the fate that they are guaranteed to get if I don't do something. But generally, we should try not to do this. The other time I've done it quite successfully is where the bees were contained. In this situation, they were contained in a wheelie bin. So it was relatively easy to move that nest into an area where it was going to cause less problems. If you are going to do it, in theory, you want to do it at night when all the bees are in the nest, and you want to make sure the entrances are blocked. And you need to move that nest either relatively close by. So if it was in a garden, you might relocate it to the back of the garden so that people can still use their garden, or you need to locate it a long way away so that the bees are completely out of that area. But you must consider the environment. You must think about the consequences. It's not good just to pick an animal up and dump it in an environment. We need to think about, will it survive in that environment? And just as an example, this tree bumblebee that we've just looked at, it is quite a generalist feeder, but it prefers and needs to be around things like brambles and oilseed rape and those kind of things, which is quite handy because those plants are quite accessible. But if you've got other species of bumblebee, then it's important to understand what plants are they feeding from. It might be quite a narrow range of plants, so we might need to think about the location we're putting them in just to make sure that they've got what they need to survive. So onto the solitary bees, and this is 90% of all of the bees. I think there's some 270 species of bee in the UK. Remember, there's 1 species of honeybee, 24 species of bumblebee, and all the rest of them are what we call these solitary bees. Some of them can sting. There is a potential for that. Generally, they don't have this kind of herd mentality, I suppose, is one way to look at it when you've got the social bees. Animals that have evolved socially have understood the survival of the colony is better than their own survival. And identification can be difficult. It can be difficult. Looking at the wing veins is a good place to start. And again, there can be specificity in terms of feeding on different plants in some species, whereas some can feed across many different plants. So solitary and social bees can be separated. And this is a good picture that sort of shows the difference in the two. The social bees represented by this bumblebee on this side here, very effective pollen collectors. They wet the pollen, they stick it on these back legs, and they're able to transport it back. Solitary bees don't have this adaptation. They don't have these sort of adapted back tibia legs. So they tend to have these kind of hairs on the underside of the abdomen or hairs on the legs. And it tends to be a dry pollen as opposed to a wet pollen. But this is why solitary bees are much better pollinators, because they're not very good at collecting pollen. There's not a need for them to be really good because they've only got a few mouths to feed as opposed to 400 so for this bumblebee or many thousand for a honeybee. So that's one of the key characteristics. Wing veins are important. There are some great field guides. This is a fantastic book by Stephen Falt and really good, really nice book. I would certainly recommend that to be in your library. And as always with any insect identification, I would always point people online to something called Mike's Insect Keys. And in this, he's got all the different orders of insects. They are quite, proper scientific taxonomic keys, but very worthwhile. Typical life cycle of a solitary bee, again, is very different. It's very different. So we have a dormant adult, not a queen, a dormant adult has survived because there's no caste system, there's no social structure. So the dormant adult, they're starting to wake up now, they're coming out, they're starting to feed, to gather the nesting material, the pollen, the materials they're going to use for their nest in the next few months. And the egg, the larvae and the pupae are going to develop through April through into September. Some of them go further into November, depending on the species. And sometimes they can have 1, 2, or sometimes even 3 generations during that period of time. Come the winter, they're going to go into dormancy again. So often you've got the pupae in the nest, which is going to start developing into the adult over the winter period, ready to burst out in the following sort of springtime. And they're able to do that because of the pollen and the nectar that's been placed inside the nest. And if we look at this one on the side here, we can see this is the red masonry bee. And there's the nest here, if that's the right word. And we've got 3 brood cells, each with an individual egg, a wall lining, and you can see the pollen and nectar there, that when the egg hatches out, the larvae is going to start eating that. And it's got all the nutrients and things that it needs to go through that development process. So just to have a quick look at a couple of different species from some of the different groups. These are the plasterer bees. These are, I say they're bee-like in the sense of if you asked a child to draw a bee, they would draw a yellow and black striped animal. And to me, this is probably more bee-like than honeybees. And there are 9 of these different species. Like many of these, they like to nest in a sandy soil. But these have these large aggregations. So they're individual nests, as with most of the social bees, individual nests, but because they all build their nests in the same area, it gives that appearance of them being social. They do make these sort of mating balls as well. So there'll be a group of males that collect together And the one I particularly like, one of my favourite bees, if you like, would be this one here, the ivy bee. And I like this one because it comes out later in the year. And if you're an entomologist, towards the end of the year and the beginning of the year, it gets quite boring because there's not many insects to look at in the UK. And this is one of the rare ones because it's tied its life cycle in with ivy, which is one of our latest blooming plants in the UK. They can sting. The mining bees, these are our largest group of bees in the UK. There's great variation between the different species here, but they tend to go into the ground. So these are bees that sometimes can cause conflict with buildings, although your building probably has some kind of damage to it anyway to allow the bees to start. And they do build these solitary nests. Hopefully my video will play. Hopefully you can see the bees buzzing around, and hopefully you can see all the soil that's been excavated in these almost little volcano-like extractions. And this is probably the start to the calls that we'll get in a few weeks' time, because they are some of the earliest appearing bees, and they don't sting. And there we have one of the Andrena bees there on my finger. The masonry bees, Megachilidae, there's different bees within that family. Again, large bees, and these need existing cavities. The ones we've just seen, perhaps able to do some mining, if that's the right word. These ones are going to need a hole. There's about 12 species, and probably the most commonly occurring one is this red mason bee, Osmina biocornis, which is pictured here. And this has horns at the front of it, which are quite characteristic. Really common, really very common, and in everyone's garden. Quite an early appearing bee as well. Some other members of the Melachilidae, the leafcutter bees, and these are quite characteristic in their behaviour of cutting semicircular holes within leaves that they then pack out an existing hole. And last year I had one of these in just outside my front door. There was an old hole in the wall, and you could see, very much like the picture below, you could see the little bits of plant sticking out of them. They have these characteristic orange sort of pollen brushes under their abdomen. Quite a later one from an appearance point of view, going from later end of summer, and again needing that pre-existing cavity, and they can sting. Thankfully my house is okay. It didn't fall down because there was a small colony of perhaps 3 leafcutter bees in my wall. My 3 children survived. They didn't get stung. Myself and my wife were okay. We survived our experience with solitary bees nesting in the wall of our house. And I would strongly suggest that that's a story, that's an approach we take with our customers. These bees have got busy things to do rather than to come and sting us. Obviously, if we were to poke in their holes, they might instigate a sting, but generally they'll leave us alone. Nomad bees is where it starts to get quite interesting again. These are, again, kleptoparasitic of other bee species. They just go in there and parasitize an existing bee nest, quite characteristic from a bee, but we start to get confused with wasp species. In summary, how do we manage these? And it's all about education for me. Educating the customers using signage, perhaps in a business, in a park, in a school, but having discussions with people, giving them confidence that these bees will not cause chemical treatment. For me, absolutely 100% the absolute last resort. I accept that there will be some situations where this will be necessary, but it should not be a normal approach to managing these pests. And again, reading product labels, which is something we always should do, we'll see that on all product labels of insecticides, it actually says in the warning section that it's hazardous to bees. So that gives us a clue as to what the kind of mindset is of people with chemicals and bees. And the mindset, I believe, is we shouldn't be using them. Certainly if you've got nests going into the ground, then there's a definite no there, because a lot of the chemicals that we have are only approved to go onto surfaces, as you'll see on the last section of the label that I've put on the screen there. But if you are going to treat a solitary bee's nest for a safety reason, maybe it's a nest or an aggregation, of solitary bees that's occurred in a nursery play area or something along those lines, then just make sure that you have full justification for what you're doing and you're prepared to stand by those decisions and receive some pretty harsh questioning on why you've taken that action. Removing harbourage is one thing that can be done. I could go out there and start repairing all the damaged mortar in my building. I haven't. It was a few years ago. My house is just about still standing. So it's something that can be done if there's particular areas where we don't want some of these bees to appear. Perhaps providing alternative harbourage could be something that we could consider, although that may attract more bees into the area that you don't want them in. So careful thought process needs to go. I think in summary there, I think we should understand solitary bees and other bees, and we should be in a position, as professional pest controllers, to explain, educate the customer as to why we've taken the decisions that we've taken, and we should use this as a positive way to engage with our customers to help promote us as professional pest controllers, not simply, if he's got 6 legs, I'll just whack some chemical down. I think that's a very dangerous approach to be taken as a professional pest manager. Hopefully I've not run over by too much, and I've left maybe some time for some questions if people want to ask any questions.
Yeah, we've got time for questions. Don't worry. We'll just have a slightly shorter break. No, appreciate you doing talk. I think solitary bees, I think it's an area that is overlooked in pest control as just in general ID. So we do have a question around ivy bees. Do you find that they stay in the same area? So, would you find that you'll get ivy bees if you've got them once, you're going to get them every year, or do you tend to find they move on?
Yeah, the ivy bee and a lot of these things, insects are a product of their environment. So if you've got a good source of food, and an ivy bee is quite focused on a singular food source or a key food source. So anywhere you have ivy, I think that continual, I'm not going to call it a problem because it's not a problem, that continual blessing of having ivy bees every year within your garden. So yes, they will tend to stick around the same area. It makes sense so long as there's areas that nests can be developed, the food source is there. Why would you move?
Yeah. No, I'd get call outs at the end going, we've got wasps. And it'd be like, it is usually ivy bees, and it might be the odd wasp nestled in among them, just getting that last little bit of prep for the nest and stuff.
Yeah.
No, great. I really appreciate you coming in and taking the time to talk about it. Really enjoyed it. And
no worries.
Yeah, no, wonderful. Thank you very much. So
is that the solitary question that I've got? Fantastic.
Solitary question. Wonderful. Yes, we'll take a quick 5-minute break and then we'll be back at 11. Obviously, Paul, you're free to hang around if you like. And we shall see you back in a few minutes. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everyone.